Hey, party people. Today, we're reading the final chapter of Christos Memos' Open Marxism, Critical Theory as Militant Enlightenment. The final chapter is chapter 6, and it's titled Open Marxism as Critical Theory and the Struggle for a New Global Human Condition. A few days after Adorno's funeral, a statement appeared in the Frankfurter Rundschau entitled Continuing Critical Theory, in which some of Adorno's youngest students expressed their concerns about the continuation of the early Frankfurt School critical theory and their fears that the, quote, inflation of Adorno into a hero of the intellect would turn critical theory into a museum piece, end quote. In a similar vein, in one of his interviews after Adorno's death, Marcuse expressed his hope that, quote, Adorno's death would not mean the extinction of the revolutionary spark that Adorno saw glowing at the heart of his ruthless critique, end quote. Cited in Müller-Düm, 2009. Adorno himself was well aware of the fact that, quote, not only theory but also theory's absence becomes a material force when it seizes the masses, end quote. Adorno, inducing the masses into a state of passivity, mystification, abstention, and manipulation. Adorno's words signaled his specific concern and hope that the critical path would remain open. Quote, whatever has once been taught can be suppressed, forgotten can vanish, but it cannot be denied that something of it survives, for thinking has the element of the universal. What once was thought cogently must be thought elsewhere by others. This confidence accompanies even the most solitary and powerless thought, end quote. Adorno. As one of the currents of subversive and negative critical theory, the development of the open Marxist tradition confirmed Adorno's confidence that thought has an element of the universal. It is collective social thought. It both belongs and does not belong to individuals. It is attached and it is not attached to specific places, countries, and historical periods. Critical theorists represent literally and metaphorically, quote, the being nowhere at home, end quote, the, quote, homelessness, the existential exile, end quote, Löwenthal. In one of his letters to Thomas Mann, Adorno made a similar point, quote, one no longer feels at home anywhere, but then, of course, someone whose business is ultimately demythologization should hardly complain too much about this, end quote. Adorno. Open Marxism's greatest achievement is that open Marxism continued, expounded, and renewed the critical theory of society. It carried forward the business of demythologization and demystification and the tradition of militant, critical, and progressive enlightenment, which maintained that, quote, the Enlightenment must examine itself if men are not to be wholly betrayed, end quote, Adorno and Horkheimer. This process of reflection, examination, and negative critique does not only concern capitalist modernity. Open Marxists argue that it must be equally applied to its radical and socialist critics, in particular to the elements of dogmatism, positivism, scientificism, mystification, and theological thinking that survived in the Marxist traditions of Leninism, Stalinism, social democracy, and their errors. At its most radical and subversive moments, the open Marxist critical theory is critical enlightenment conscious of itself, the objective of which is to change from darkness to light, from quantity to quality, from falsehood to truth, from conformity to subversion, from meaningless and the accumulation of the unessential and unimportant to the search for what is essential and important. It signifies a critical undertaking to illuminate, demystify, and invert a false and inverted world, and as such to criticize the, quote, reified appearances of the existing social relations, end quote. For open Marxism, the critique of the reified capitalist reality amounts to the perception that the capitalist modernity in the Enlightenment stood on its head. The capitalist modernity is the Enlightenment stood on the Enlightenment's head. Equally, the project of human emancipation has been articulated by open Marxist critical theorists involves a subversive critique of the traditional left and institutional Marxism and all its variants for retreating into mythology, regressing to ideology, metaphysical and theological thinking, and replacing the struggle for truth, freedom, and a qualitatively different society with the struggle for success, power, and domination. However, uncompromising and uncoordinated critical thinking the task of critical theorists to corrupt the corrupted from the dogmatism of ideology and the idolization of exploitative and power relations cannot be safely, quickly, and easily satisfied. Critical scholars have no, quote, mythical certainty, end quote, on their side, and critical scholars can only advance their critical and emancipatory project by, quote, working their way through the darkness without a lamp, without possessing the positive, through the higher concept of the negation, end quote, and by immersing themselves in the, quote, darkness as deeply as one possibly can, end quote. Adorno. Working and co-thinking with the most subversive, negative, and liberating elements of the critical theory of open Marxism, one could seek to illuminate and demystify the conversion of traditional left institutional Marxism into a socially necessary illusion, bureaucratic manipulation, ideological mystification, and mass deception, and to understand the destructive and self-destructive tendencies and decline, the reified character, successive crises, and disintegration of the various forms of institutional Marxism, as well as the dissolution, marginalization, and state of insignificance into which the other forms of dogmatic and structural Marxism have fallen, cannot be construed as isolated episodes in the history of the socialist movement, nor hypostatized and disconnected from the social and historical context. They can only be elucidated as the, quote, process stored in the object, end quote, Adorno, as something that has historically, socially, and politically produced and passed through various phases of transformation, mutation, and inversion. Since its crystallization as an ideology and a scientific worldview, Marxism has borne within it the anticipation of Marxism's permanent state of crisis and death. After the conflicts and splits with anarchists in the First International for personal, historical, and political reasons, the majority of traditional socialists took the prevalent position and hegemony of some kind of Marxism within the anti-capitalist and revolutionary movement for granted and as totally natural. Based on this unreflected and dogmatic presupposition and mystification, Marxian critical theory degenerated into a dogma that was used to legitimate the pragmatism and opportunism of, quote, left politics and the state policies of Soviet Union-type regimes. Critical thinking was transmuted into a closed system of thought and converted into state ideology and orthodoxy. However, quote, closed systems are bound to be finished, end quote. Adorno. Instead of endorsing a social and theoretical critique of all existing ideologies based on the experience of their injustice and deceptive mendacity, and thus upholding a practice that contributes to the creation of an open and free socialist society, theory and practice were severed, and both were degraded, and as a result, quote, practice became non-conceptual, a piece of the politics it was supposed to lead out of. It became the prey of power, end quote. Adorno. The Marxian tenet that the emancipation of the working class must be the work of the working class itself, and the result of the political education, intellectual maturity, and struggles of the self-conscious, independent movement of the immense majority in the interest of the immense majority became inverted. The idea of autonomous and independent class politics, the workers' councils as a means of self-emancipation, and the struggle between capital and labor were replaced by the concept of party politics, the conflict between party leadership, and the uncritical endorsement of and adherence to parliamentarism. Instead of being aimed at the critique and destruction of the state, socialist politics was identified with statism, state property, and a centrally planned economy. The idea of self-management and self-government of free and associated producers was reduced to state management and state ownership of the means of production. The abolition of the class system and all class divisions, which was one of the most fundamental aims of socialist politics, was transformed into the socialist objective and necessity of creating and forming a vast working class and turning the vast majority of society into workers as a result of a process of forced collectivization and ruthless industrialization. The negation of abstract labor as a fundamental element of the critique of political economy, and the critique of labor for being part of the ascetic society, part of the ascetic ideology of the bourgeoisie were exchanged for the glorification of work and degenerated into the demand for more jobs and the right for everyone to work. Marx's critique of political economy was reduced to the search and formulation of a superior socialist political economy. The conception of Marxist economics as the proper and infallible science that could discover the laws of society and history generated peculiar metaphysics of history and contributed to the establishment of a historical determinism and a secular eschatology. Factory work and Lenin's idea of factory schooling that would spread factory discipline across the whole of society were praised and elevated to be part of socialist morality, while industrial production and technological development, as well as dominance over nature, were considered to be evidence of the advance and progress of socialism. Finally, the quote, cult of personality, end quote, the focus on the advance of a free and autonomous socialized communist individual, and the idea that socialism is the development of individual talents and differences were debased into a, quote, personality cult, and the worship of the images and statues of the party and state leaders, which took up absurd theological and humiliating forms. The idea of a politically mature, educated, self-reliant, and autonomous socialist individual was replaced by fanatical party members and adherents who were indoctrinated in the credo of the party and state ideology, which they regurgitated mechanically without being able to understand and think about it critically. The distinctness of open Marxism is largely associated with open Marxism's contribution to the transcendence of the crisis of emancipatory politics, its legacy and its relevance to the social struggles for a free and open socialist society. It is also intimately linked to the active political issues of the day. If Adorno is right to state that, quote, another reason why the world has not changed is that too little is interpreted, end quote, Adorno, and that, quote, interpretation is much the same as criticism, end quote, interpretation is much the same as criticism, end quote, and therefore, quote, there can really be no interpretation that is not critical interpretation, end quote, Adorno. Then the open Marxist tradition can make an enormous contribution to the continuity and renewal of critical theory and the revival of emancipatory politics and critical understanding of the global capitalist society. This requires, as a precondition, however, that open Marxism must not be construed and utilized as another, quote, true Marxism, which has been developed on the basis of a correct reading of the original writings of Marx and a more or less fashionable trend in capitalist universities. Such an approach could easily, quote, lead to a new exegesis, thereby increasing the number of Marxisms and augmenting the existing ideological chaos, end quote, rebel. To paraphrase what Clark wrote in another context, it is, quote, important not to be uncritical, not to neutralize, end quote, open Marxism by merely, quote, understanding open Marxism, eulogizing open Marxism, and consigning open Marxism to a role of academic honor, end quote. Clark. Obviously, Clark's not saying open Marxism there, but I added it in, substituted it for it to make sense of what Memos was saying, end quote. Nor must open Marxism be seen as another ideology which could result in the further fetishization of theory, the construction of a new jargon, and the idolatry of terms and neologisms. Although in the past it has been used for certain historical and political reasons to distinguish this critical tradition of Marxist thought from the closed, dogmatic, and institutional forms of Marxism, the use of the term, quote, open Marxism is itself problematic and a contradiction in terms. The word, quote, Marxism, end quote, has connotations of a closed ideology that cannot be open. At its most repulsive historical and political moments, it implies the existence of an absolute truth and infallible dogma. It suggests a, quote, official truth, end quote, and a sort of church and religious sect that is followed mechanically and dogmatically by fanatical adherents who seek the purpose of their existence and what distinguishes them from other Marxisms and radical theories. Needless to say, for Marx, quote, materialism is critical rather than a positive confession of faith, end quote. Schmidt. And the concept of ideology, and he would certainly think that the same about, quote, Marxist ideology, end quote, had a pejorative connotation which denoted a, quote, socially necessary illusion, false consciousness, end quote, Schmidt. The terms, quote, Marxism and, quote, Marxist were also forged by Marx's adversaries, particularly anarchists in the First International, as, quote, pejoratives for use in moments of polemic, end quote, rebel. As a result of its transformation into a title of glory and its use as a, quote, socially necessary illusion, end quote, by the ruling class and the Stalinist regimes, the term, quote, Marxism, end quote, has been employed pejoratively since 1991. When it is used mechanically today by insignificant political sects and upper middle class research technicians in Western universities, its meaning has been so abused and violated that hardly anyone can say precisely what it means. Starting with the pejorative use of the term, quote, Marxism, and ending up with a similar, quote, pejorative use today, it seems to have gone full circle. Open Marxism cannot be hypostatized as the only correct theory or Marxist current that posits itself as the ultimate criterion against which to judge the fidelity to Marx. That's theological, magical, and mythical thinking. Open Marxism can only be valuable to the struggles of freedom and human emancipation if open Marxism entails a fundamental critique of the theological thinking which still exists within the broader socialist tradition. The recent somewhat renewed interest in Marx's work has been marked by the publication of new multi-volume biographies and free online courses consisting of close readings and correct interpretations of Marx's Capital, introductions and commentaries of his work accompanied by the search and discovery of newly available and previously unknown and unpublished holy manuscripts. Seeking for revelation and the liberating truth in Marx's sacred and prophetic scripts and acting like Protestant theologians who dictate how to read Marx rightly and correctly on the grounds that no matter what happened in real life, Marx's ideas are correct, falls short even of traditional theory. Once again, Marx becomes a, quote, kind of oracle whose Sibylline revelations had to be painstakingly investigated by a new hermeneutics, end quote. Rubel. That's kind of funny for coming from Rubel, because Rubel is like one of the main people whose name is associated with Marxology. In its attempt to criticize the inverted capitalist world and demystify economic and political abstractions, open Marxism can only be subversive if open Marxism continues to be literally and metaphorically a, quote, subterranean strand of critical theory, end quote, and that understands Marx's thought as open and anti-dogmatic, open to rectification and continuation, and not concerned with philology. As Agnoli put it, quote, Marx wanted neither to construct nor affirm. Marx wanted primarily to negate, end quote. Agnoli. An important lesson to be learned from the history of the socialist tradition is that Marxism does not enter into crisis when Marxism is understood as a subversive critical theory of society, and as long as its negative critique and revolutionary praxis provoke and produce crises in capitalism and in any other authoritarian and exploitative social formation. Marxism gets into a state of crisis when Marxism comes to a standstill, a closed system and established ideology, when Marxism loses its dangerousness. At the core of open Marxism's approach lies the proposition that Marxism is critical social theory, and not a state and party ideology, needs to present a threat to capitalism and regain its revolutionary bite. Conversely, the institutionalization of Marxism as an all-inclusive and closed worldview, its establishment as an official doctrine of a political movement in subordination to the material and power interests of a political organization or a social regime, lead inevitably to its reduction to ideological demagogy and its decline and decomposition. As a self-enclosed doctrine and ideology, dogmatic Marxism manipulates and controls thinking, and at the same time claims to be science and represents the authentic thought of Marx. It uses stereotypical phrases, offers cliché explanations emptied of all substance and content, and seeks to apply abstract universal frameworks that provide answers to everything. The, quote, base superstructure, end quote, formula is one of its most favorite schemata. It asks for absolute faithfulness to the classical text of Marxism and claims knowledge for the correct interpretation. If reality or new social phenomena have not been dealt with in the holy text, then the texts are searched for passages and specific points that somehow correspond to and explicate or have predicted contemporary events and facts. In most cases, reality is forcibly reduced to a precise, fixed and doctrinary position, and selected facts are used in order to confirm ideological assumptions. This process leads to the closure of critical thought as categories are not open to the inclusion of new elements and are frozen. In this way, concepts and terms are hypostatized, although they are mediated, historically conditioned, and socially constituted. Instead of disclosing the reified social reality and reflecting upon the mechanisms of this reification, closed Marxism demands that reality adapt to the dogma of the ideology. In turn, the closure and unchangeable character of Marx's categories absolutizes reification and makes it appear immutable and eternal. Hypostatizing the ossified experience is something absolute, and an ultimate given implies the inability to explain its social genesis and truth. If the ossified character of capitalist production relations cannot be revealed, comprehended, and derived from the social processes that generated them, then critical reason retreats to myth and tends to be converted into newly created mythologies in order to explain the reified character of experience. As a result, quote, myth is already enlightenment and enlightenment reverts to mythology, end quote. Adorno and Horkheimer. The loss of independent thought and the degradation of theoretical thinking, together with the fear and dislike of critique, meant that Marxian thinking and Marxist theory were reduced to a complete and closed theoretical system, which consisted of a rigid and dogmatic set of tenets. Theory was demoted to a scholastic commentary and downgraded to a search for the correct formulation in relation to the holy text. Quote, history was unfolded from theory rather theory from history. Quote, history was unfolded from theory rather than theory from history, end quote. Bonafelt. The so-called political left, which historically expressed and represented the adjusted orthodox Marxism of the Second and Third Internationals, not only failed to criticize and demystify the myths and ideologies of contemporary capitalism, but also produced, reproduced, and further yielded to its own mystifications, myths, and ideologies. According to Axelos, one of the reasons for the crises and petrification of institutional Marxism was that it abandoned radical and questioning thought. By degrading the Marxian critical categories into a, quote, wasteland of dead categories, end quote, Kozik, concepts became part of an ideology. Ideological thinking disregards the fact that concepts are socially conditioned and produced, and therefore converts the, quote, congealed product of a dynamic process into something that simply exists in itself, and thus fetishizes it in the process. In this sense, ideology and fetishism are identical with each other, end quote. Adorno. To this end, and in order to eradicate all mystifications and mythologizations, and foster a critical thought that calls everything into question and keeps the question open, Open Marxism's distinct approach was articulated as an ongoing struggle to free critical theory from the dogmatic restraints of the apologetic and ideological demagogy of institutional Marxism. Open Marxism sought to negate and denounce all kinds of ideology, including, quote, all forms of institutionalized Marxism, end quote, which are seen as a, quote, school of confusion and illusions, end quote. Striving to promote critical thinking against ideologies and mythologies, Open Marxism tried to, quote, open up discussion of Marxist work and not to impose a new closure, end quote. Simon Clark. As part of a concerted attempt to, quote, reinvigorate Marxist theory as a revolutionary force, end quote. Clark. According to Kozik, quote, a return to Marx is a return to critical thinking, and any modern critical thinking cannot ignore Marx, end quote. Kozik. However, if a return to Marx does not mean engaging in a further, quote, sterile and conservative scholasticism, end quote, Godin, about what Marx, quote, really meant, end quote, then a return to Marx in the opening of the discussion about his thought means, quote, breaking the spell of the mythology surrounding Marx, end quote. Rubel. It purports to apply dialectics as a subversive critique of demystification, decipherment, and demythologization to all social phenomena of capitalist society and to all ideologies and mythologies, including socialism, Marxism, and Marx. In his endeavor to demythologize Marx, Korsch reminded us that Marx is, quote, only one of many precursors, founders, and developers of the socialist working class movement, end quote. Korsch. And Papaioannou made a similar point in his critique of Orthodox Marxism's religious attitude towards Marx. Quote, Marx is not Hermes the Very Great, nor is Marx the legendary ancestor to whom the invention of fire and the extermination of the monsters have to be attributed. Marx is a historical personage and we must study Marx in the same manner we study Kant or Descartes, end quote. Luxemburg also made a very interesting comment in relation to critical theory and subversive practice and their stance towards Marxist theorizing. Quote, "It is undeniable that Marx has had a somewhat restrictive influence upon the free development of theory in the case of many of his pupils. Both Marx and Engels found it necessary to disclaim responsibility for the utterances of many who chose to call themselves Marxist. The scrupulous endeavor to keep, quote, within the bounds of Marxism, end quote, may at times have been just as disastrous to the integrity of the thought process as has been the other extreme, the complete repudiation of the Marxist outlook and the determination to manifest, quote, independence of thought, end quote, at all hazards," end quote. Luxemburg. Gotta copy that down. Where the hell am I? Okay. End quote. Luxemburg. The dialectical approach to Marx that Luxemburg adopts has significant theoretical and political implications and could act as an initial methodological precaution for dealing with the theoretical heritage of the socialist movement, and more specifically with Marxist thought. It suggests that the movement of critical reason and radical praxis must be premised on a constant contradictory drive, balancing and passing from the scylla of the, quote, dogmatico-apologetic attitude, end quote, and the Charybdis, I can't remember how to pronounce that, of, quote, nihilism, or as Adorno phrased it, between, quote, Marx dogmatism, end quote, and, quote, Marx phobia, end quote. Luxemburg highlights one of the main reasons for the theoretical sterility of the socialist movement. At one extreme lay the concept of an orthodox Marxist theory which presents itself as the one and only absolute truth. Marxist theorizing was perceived and adopted as a complete and unchanging dogma. I don't know if I used this quote from Lenin, but there's a quote from Lenin that says, Marxism is all powerful because it's true, or something like that. Marxist theorizing was perceived and adopted as a complete and unchanging dogma. Scholars, militants, political parties, and regimes espoused a semi-religious attitude towards Marx, and a, quote, legend, end quote, about Marx and his writings was created. In many cases, the deification of Marx took on semi-religious dimensions, and Marx's critical and radical thinking was canceled. The more Marx was worshipped, the more statues or monuments of Marx were erected, and the more towns, cities, or streets were named after Marx, the more Marxist thought was frozen, ossified, and rigidified into a repressive dogma, and arguably the less it was actually thought through and critically examined. Marxist theory was imposed on the radical movement as a predetermined and well-structured theoretical system, and praxis should therefore be adjusted and unfolded from a scholastic interpretation of Marx's texts. Critical theory in that sense was reduced to, quote, Talmudic commentary on sacred texts, end quote, Castoriadis. Theory was separated from practice, and their relationship was posited as an external one. At the one extreme lay the nihilist stance towards Marx and Marxism, which for many activist scholars and political groups implied the loss of one of the theoretical foundations for socialist and left anti-capitalist theoretical and practical activity. As Karl Kozik aptly pointed out, quote, anything without a foundation is unstable, shallow, empty, end quote, and by losing our foundation we are, quote, overcome by nothingness, end quote, and, quote, nothing means nihil, end quote. Kozik. Clark nicely captured the relationship that the revival of the emancipatory movement must develop with regard to Marxist thought when Clark wrote that, quote, whether or not Marx's name is attached to such a movement is neither here nor there. What matters is that we should take full advantage of the insights that Marx's work has to offer, end quote. Clark. The fall of the Berlin Wall was not seen by the traditional left as an opportunity to free Marx from the positivist, economistic, and deterministic elements that exist in his writings, or to emancipate Marx from the dogmatic interpretations and the theoretical and political inversions of his thought made by the various kinds of institutional Marxism. Nor was the collapse seen as an opportunity to critically re-examine and get rid of Marx's personal and political, quote, attitudes which contradict certain principles of the ethic of self-emancipation, end quote, inherent in his critical thought. Rebel. Some of these personal limitations, malice, or authoritarian attitudes expressed, among other things, in his theoretical and political conflicts with other socialists or anarchists have regrettably become a feature of the, quote, toxic theoretical heritage and culture of the socialist tradition. In his letter to Proudhon on the 5th of May, 1846, Marx called on Proudhon to cooperate more closely to establish regular contact with the German, French, and English socialists. The key aim of this connection would be to provide the European socialist movement with a context in which socialists could exchange information regarding the progress and experience of their social, political, and theoretical struggles. In this sense, different perspectives and, quote, differences of opinion, quote, could be, quote, brought to light, and an exchange of ideas and impartial criticism, end quote, could take place. In his reply on the 17th of May, 1846, Proudhon wrote, quote, let us seek together, if you wish, the laws of society, the manner in which these laws are realized, the process by which we shall succeed in discovering them, but for God's sake, after having demolished all the a priori dogmatisms, do not let us in our turn dream of indoctrinating the people. Do not let us leave humanity with a similar mess to clear up as a result of our efforts. I apply with all my heart your thought of bringing all opinions to light. Let us carry on a good and loyal polemic. Let us give the world an example of learned and far-sighted tolerance. But let us not, merely because we are at the head of a movement, make ourselves the leaders of a new intolerance. Let us not pose as the apostles of a new religion, even if it be the religion of logic, the religion of reason. Let us gather together and encourage all protests. Let us brand all exclusiveness, all mysticism. Let us never regard a question as exhausted, and when we have used our last argument, let us begin again, if need be, with eloquence and irony. On that condition, I will gladly enter your association. Otherwise, no! Exclamation point. End quote. Proudhon. The course of events and the decline of the socialist movement have vindicated Proudhon in expressing these fears and concerns. In place of common goals, united action, learnt and far-sighted tolerance, openness, critical solidarity, and comradely exchange of views and critiques, irony and humor, as Agnoli and Kozik reminded us, the socialist tradition, which included both Marxists and anarchists, has been marked by various apostles of a new religion, a priori dogmatism, new intolerance, exclusiveness, absolute truths, and mutual hostility and malice. Instead of freeing Marx and the socialist movement from this culture of self-imposed immaturity, the post-1990s left realized and completed a move which had started in the 1960s to, quote, free itself from Marx, end quote, and abandon, quote, negative critique, end quote. As Bonafelt argued in line with Agnoli, this development resulted in, quote, social critique as a destructive critique, end quote, being, quote, replaced by servitude to ... the academic industry, end quote. And by extension, quote, left social theory began, and by extension, quote, left social theory being reduced to a, quote, theoretical expression of the zeitgeist, a zeitgeist which theoretical fashions seek to reinforce and exploit, end quote. Or, as Jacobi subtly put it, quote, the struggle to publish replaced the class struggle, end quote. The, quote, new politics of the post-1990s, quote, left, or rather of the leftovers, of what was previously defined as left politics and the new left-wing political parties engaged in a, quote, generalized pseudo-consensus, end quote. And by disregarding and abnegating negative and subversive critique, the, quote, became rationalizers for what is, end quote, and, quote, justifiers of the established order, end quote, Castoriadis. Thus, according to Bonafelt, by abandoning, quote, negative critique, end quote, in favor of, quote, new and newer concepts which are based on the theoretical tradition of positivism, end quote, the left has lost its theoretical, quote, home, and has endorsed and espoused the liberal and bourgeois theoretical agenda. Does the tradition of, quote, negative critique still need Marx's critical theory and, quote, warm currents, end quote, block? Is Marx still part of our theoretical home? To paraphrase Rebel's question, quote, did the proletariat need Marx, end quote? Does the proletariat still need Marx and the various Marxisms? And overall, quote, did Marxism help the proletariat, end quote? The answer to the above question is more complex than it appears. Marxist thinking both is and is not our theoretical, quote, home. For Stoyanovich, quote, Marx must remain an important inspiration for us, but we must not make an obstacle of Marx, end quote. Stoyanovich. On the one hand, Marxist thought is not our theoretical, quote, home, and becomes an obstruction when it is converted into a self-enclosed doctrine of insignificant political sects, or a closed system of thought, a worldview and an established ideology that legitimize authoritarian governments, oppression and exploitation. It is reduced to a hindrance and loses its negativity, dangerousness, and revolutionary bite when it becomes absorbed in the waves of fashionable trends in academia and complements the role of the ruling ideology, and when it claims to be an all-inclusive science, a cosmology and a mode of theorizing that provides the one and only scientific interpretation of the objective laws of capitalist society. Arguing against the understanding and use of Marxist thought as a, quote, universal and scientific system, end quote, Labriola made a very insightful comment in his critique of Plekhanov, thus anticipating to a large extent what would happen to Marxism, Leninism, Stalinism 100 years later. Quote, this arrogant way of speaking of science will make scientific socialism laughable before the whole world. The guilt resides in the fact that many people look upon Marxism as a new kind of universal wisdom, end quote. And Labriola, cited in Jacobi. On the other hand, Marxist thought is our home when it is understood as a, quote, still living thought, end quote. It must remain open, a project open to critique, development, continuation, and modification, and is a critical theory of society that enhances the subversive and negative critique of global capitalist society. Marxian thinking is our home when, quote, rather than having constituted the end of our theoretical labor, Marxism constitutes a moment of its beginning, end quote. Fraccia and Ryan, 1992. That's an open Marxism. Instead of being understood as a universal philosophy of history and an academic hobby, Marxian critical theory and dialectics are grasped as a critique of knowledge and reality that demystifies the reified forms of society in order to disclose their historical origin and social genesis and reveal them as creations of human practice. Quote, dialectics, as Markovich argued, quote, is primarily a method of criticism, not, however, a criticism of concepts, but a criticism of real social relationships, not a fictitious and mystifying, but a real and truly revolutionary criticism, end quote. Markovich. The task of dialectics is to expose the contradictions in things themselves, and hence dialectical reasoning aims at the, quote, destruction of mystification and of the pseudo-concrete, end quote. Kozik. Marxism, according to Bonefeld, is, quote, neither a theory of oppression/domination nor an economic theory, but a theory of the contradictions of social reality, and, as such, a theory of the historical movement of the contradictions of domination, end quote. Bonefeld. One of the distinctive achievements of the open Marxist approach is that it detached Marx from the idolatry of professional Marxists, and from being an emasculated image in a party banner or a state propaganda poster, a petrified museum piece, or a demolished statue in a town square somewhere in Eastern Europe, and reinstated his thought as a critical, demystifying theory and as a work of the tradition of militant, critical, and progressive Enlightenment. Working and struggling with the Marxian categories, open Marxists make them, quote, dance, again by ascribing to them the tension and critical character that developed in their struggle with the historically specific social reality. In this sense, the frozen social forms and reified institutions of capitalist society can be dissolved and decoded as modes of existence of the antagonistic social relations of production. That is, the class antagonism between capital and labor. The open Marxist critical theorists severely criticize the theological thinking that purports to make a distinction between the, quote, new and, quote, old Marx. Likewise, the analysis of structures in the 1859, quote, preface concerning the, quote, holy schema of the economic base superstructure was rejected and replaced by the focus on social constitution, process, and antagonistic social relations. The negative critical theory of open Marxism adopts an openness to experience, an openness to the, quote, inner nature of social phenomena themselves, end quote, an activity which Bonefeld calls, quote, substantive abstraction, end quote, which is an openness to their, quote, constitution and process, end quote, to the, quote, social relations of production, end quote, and the, quote, class antagonism between capital and labor, end quote. Bonafelt. As Holloway noted, quote, Marx's starting point is the, quote, sum total of relations of production, end quote. It is only vulgar materialism, end quote, and the orthodox Marxism of social democracy and Leninism-Stalinism that, quote, made the relationship between the economy and other aspects of society a unilateral, direct causal one, end quote. Holloway. Quote, the experience of the contradictory character of societal reality, end quote, Adorno wrote, quote, is not an arbitrary starting point, but rather the motive which first constitutes the possibility, end quote, of a critical theory of society as such. In the same vein, Clark pointed out that, quote, the only possible foundation of social theory is the historically developed social relations which characterize a particular form of society, end quote. Simon Clark. Open Marxism's attempt to develop a critical and historical social theory was based on the premise that Marx's critical undertaking was to employ a theory and critique of the economic forms of the social relations of capitalist production. The Marxian theory was not seen as a system of historical and economic laws, but as a critique of political economy. Open Marxists expounded Marx's critique of economic categories to the critique of the social and political forms of capitalist production relations. This reinterpretation and further elaboration of Marx's thought brought to the fore a, quote, anarchist Marx, end quote, used the Marxian categories as critical categories and highlighted the most libertarian and anti-authoritarian aspects of Marx's work. This is not only a theoretical and critical rereading of Marx, it was also a political and selective reading of Marx that did not aim to restore the authentic and real Marx, but rather to clarify and emphasize those aspects of Marx's writings that are useful in the struggles for a liberating socialist alternative. The purpose of human emancipation and the objective of a revolutionary and liberating historical alternative need the, quote, anarchist, anti-authoritarian, and libertarian aspects of Marx's work. Quote, we cannot think any true thought unless we want the true, end quote. Adorno. If the purpose and quality of thinking are already a, quote, form of behavior, end quote, what we search for in the writings of Marx and other critical theory scholars has significant political implications. Our judgments, critical evaluations, and co-thinking with Marx are a kind of, quote, kind of practice, end quote, as they affect the goals of human activity and shape the direction in which we would like the social change to move. It is not possible to identify, quote, work and struggle, end quote, with the Marxian elements of self-emancipation and self-organization if one does not strive for and anticipate a society that resembles and contains these features. That is the society of free and equal associated producers, an open and free socialist society. The open Marxist tradition contributed decisively to the theoretical critique of all existing ideologies based on the experience of their injustice and unfreedom and the gap between ideologies and reality. The social critique of all ideologies is, quote, social necessary illusions, end quote, and their disillusion, quote, inaugurates a certain movement towards political maturity, end quote. Adorno. Subversive and negative critique. The use of Marxian categories as open, critical, and dialectical categories so they cannot be, quote, translated into operational terminology, end quote, and, quote, lose their element of the negatively reasonable, end quote. Schmidt. A movement towards political education, responsibility, and a, quote, humanist critical conception that is constantly being corrected and enriched by changing conditions, end quote. Schmidt. Provided a point of departure for a reinvigorated critical analysis based on a fundamental critique of capitalist modernity, Stalinism, and social democracy. Open Marxism's rethinking of Marx and the, quote, social form and, quote, analysis are not only illuminating in themselves, but also provide a lens for understanding tendencies and critically analyzing and exploring historical possibilities for the revival of emancipatory politics. If comprehending tendencies mean the ability to think, to, quote, grasp the non-identical quality of a concept within the concept itself, end quote, then the critical theory of open Marxism denotes a struggle for and a, quote, hope of truth of something qualitatively different, end quote. Adorno. By deciphering all the reified social, economic, and political forms as inverted, ephemeral appearances and creations of human practice, Negative critique delineates the possibilities and potentialities of a quantitatively different and new human condition. Negative thinking implies the negation of the pseudo-concrete that concretizes the contradictory social reality itself, and through its subversive critique, reconstructs the idea of an alternative socialist society as the, quote, utopia of the qualitative, end quote, Adorno, truth and freedom. Dialectical thinking is thinking about the, quote, otherness, end quote. It's thinking about that, quote, otherness. Dialectical thinking is the possibility of a differently constituted world. This possibility is not a reference to a general and abstract utopia or to ready-made solutions that already exist in classical Marxist texts. The tradition of open Marxism associated dialectical reason with critique and negativity, and therefore it's subversive and utopian thinking. Critical negation and openness to living experience imply a resignification of fundamental concepts and revolutionary ideas, which at the same time could lead to theoretical and practical openings, strengthening the emancipatory movement in its struggle to move from possibility and potentiality to actuality. That is, to a movement and process of self-organization and self-emancipation of society. From this perspective, the idea of utopia is, quote, the transformation of the totality, end quote, namely the, quote, capability to imagine the totality as something that could be completely different, end quote. Adorno is dialectically interlinked with the idea that, quote, utopia is the concrete and not itself some universal theory or finished recommendation for praxis, end quote. Adorno. This also applies to open Marxism's concept of revolution, which does not imply an apocalyptic event, a military coup, or an imaginary march in the winter, summer, or parliamentary palace. The concept of revolution, according to Markovitch, indicates, quote, any qualitative transformation that contributes to the liberation of man, end quote. Markovitch. It involves the revolutionary transformation of capitalist social relations and necessitates a long-winded process of self-organization of the people. Self-organization as a prolonged historical and contradictory social movement amounts to a process of self-activity and self-education of the people, during which they became aware of the difficult, nay almost impossible utopian character of this undertaking. In this self-conscious, independent, and autonomous class organization movement, self-organization means, quote, self-organizing, and consciousness is becoming conscious. Both are processes, not states, end quote, Castoriadis. Communism, as Gunn argued, is not a, quote, form of society, end quote, but the, quote, real, quote, actual movement of the working class in need of a qualitatively new life, freedom, and truth. It is a movement that amounts to a process of destruction of all the estranged, detached, and seemingly autonomous social and political forces and forms of production relations, in order for people to be able to consciously control their own form of association as a de-alienated community of free men and have the courage to be equal, quote, different without fear, end quote, aiming for the, quote, realization of universality and the reconciliation of differences, end quote. Adorno. In contrast to the open Marxist conception of communism as a movement of freedom and truth, demystification and demythologization, the Leninist, Stalinist, and social democratic conception of politics converted, quote, all questions of truth into questions of power, end quote. Adorno. However, as Axelos pointed out, institutional Marxism failed to solve the question of political power and to address it in a radical way. On the contrary, instead of recycling political power, orthodox Marxism has recycled revolution by seizing on its aftermath as an opportunity to establish new forms of authority. Open Marxism's critique of party and state forms then aimed to reclaim Marxist subversive critique and demystify the capitalist political forms, turning all the questions of power into questions of truth. It's open Marxism's critical purpose. Let me repeat that. Open Marxism's critique of party and state forms then aimed to reclaim Marxist subversive critique and demystify the capitalist political forms, turning all the questions of power into questions of truth. Its critical purpose was the, quote, politicization of social relations, end quote, and the, quote, cancellation of the concentration of the political in the form of the state, end quote. Bonafelt. In the mythologized process, which imbued with supernatural and metaphysical qualities the laws of the market, the rule of money, and the power of political institutions and leaders, open Marxism's negative critique involved a process of demythologization and demystification. It purported to the liberation from the compulsion of the economic and political institutions, with the objective of making it more and more difficult for economic, social, and political powers to exist and function separately and independently of individuals and society. It amounted to a process in which society attains consciousness of itself and becomes aware of its need to abolish class divisions and move beyond its natural history in order for man to become human and society to become social. According to Clark, quote, the lesson for socialists of the fate of the lesson for socialists of the fate of state socialism, in both its Soviet and social democratic variants, is that socialism cannot be imposed on society through the alienated form of the state, but can only be achieved by building on the self-organization of the working class. The conquest of state power, far from being the immediate ambition of a socialist movement, is a poisoned chalice, so long as the working class has not developed alternative forms of democratic organization to replace the alienated forms of state power, end quote. Clark. I think that essay that quote is from is on this channel. I think it's called Crisis of Socialism or Crisis of the State or something like that. Regression becomes progress and mythology reverts to enlightenment when power is taken from the state and party institutions and is diffused into society as the anti-power of the councils and open assemblies. As generalized anti-capitalism, anti-conformism, and anti-authoritarianism, it is politicization, political education, and maturity that engulfs the majority of life in capitalist societies. One of open Marxism's criticisms of the attempt to create a socialist society based on a state-centered approach and organization was the, quote, distance between state and society, end quote, and therefore the, quote, lack of social self-determination, end quote, self-activity and self-organization. An alternative way of achieving this for countries like Cuba is not to subordinate themselves to global capitalism and the rule of money, but rather, as Holloway noted, the, quote, strength of the revolution depends on the degree to which it is integrated into society and the state ceases to be its pivot, end quote. Holloway. The fundamental postulate for this integration into society is the deployment of alternative forms of self-organization of the working class, which are intended to replace the alienated forms of state power. Marxism as an established ideology postulated the party and state forms as eternal phenomena pertaining to all societies, thus overlooking the fact that they are transitory and historically specific political forms of definite social relations. For open Marxism, the, quote, beginning of self-emancipation is self-education, and, quote, rebel, which must be connected to the living experience of the working class. Quote, the council of the oppressed is the laboratory of communist learning by doing, end quote, Bonafelt. This idea of politics as the self-activity of the working class was totally contravened by the bourgeois conception of politics that was espoused by the orthodox communist parties and according to which the proletariat, quote, must continue to be led, planned, coordinated, disciplined, and instructed by the superior class of apparatchiks, end quote. Clark. By undermining the strength and autonomous political activity of the working class, these kinds of perceptions and practices resulted in workers becoming peculiarly depoliticized and apathetic, and in the process, quote, politics was taken out of the hands of the working class and put into those of the party, end quote. Clark. This depoliticization was further fostered by the channeling and integration of the militancy and radical political action of the working class into the representative and parliamentary institutions of the capitalist state. In addition, the, quote, parliamentary form of representation served to reinforce the divisions within the working class and expressing the competition between groups of workers, end quote. Clark, which meant that instead of struggling as a united force against capital, they found themselves struggling with each other as representatives of the different political groups. The opposition to capital was thus turned against the working class itself, and the political representation of the working class became the means by which it was, quote, divided, demobilized, and demoralized, end quote. Clark. Moreover, One of the lessons of the 1960s and 1970s was that if anti-capitalist practices are being, quote, directed to the liberation of the individual rather than the class, end quote, then it is highly likely that they will be, quote, reintegrated into the normal forms of bourgeois intercourse with relative ease, end quote. Holloway. Likewise, it became evident that the question of the forms of political organization of the working struggle against capital and the capitalist state is equally, if not more important and fundamental than the content of this struggle. The issue at stake is thus not, quote, to work through bourgeois forms to gain positions of, quote, power and, quote, influence, the hopeless, destructive illusion of Eurocommunism, but to work against those forms, to develop through practice material forms of counter-organization, forms of organization which express and consolidate the underlying unity of the resistance to class oppression, forms of organization which stand in opposition to the fetishized and fetishizing forms of bourgeois, quote, politics and, quote, economics, end quote. Holloway. A prerequisite for this process of building a socialist society on the basis of the self-organization and self-emancipation of the working class is not the uncritical acceptance of the institutions of the bourgeois state power, but the subversive critique of the political forms of capitalist society, which for open Marxists is developed together with the critique of economic forms of capitalist society. The concrete utopia of a de-alienated and open community of free men is substantiated in and through the idea of, quote, communism is the movement of negation of the existing relations in the here and now, end quote. Bonafelt. In this movement of negative critique of, quote, abstract linear production time, end quote, critical theory, quote, can no longer consider political economy as anything but a melancholy science, end quote. Breuer, 1985. The experience of the political and social struggles vindicated analogous past lessons that related to the fact that, quote, socialism is not simply about such quantitative matters as the distribution of income and wealth, pressing as such matters are. It is most fundamentally about the creation of an alternative society, end quote. Clark. As Horkheimer indicated, quote, in late capitalism, people metamorphose first into welfare recipients and then into followers, end quote. Horkheimer. A socialist alternative to right-wing politics and capitalism cannot be, quote, reduced to defense of statism and welfarism, end quote, but is about, quote, making qualitative changes, about transforming social relations, about replacing the alienated forms of capitalist political and economic regulation by new forms of collective self-organization and democratic control, end quote. Simon Clark. According to Adorno, quote, the economic relationships between people, though ostensibly of a purely economic, calculable nature, are in reality nothing but congealed interpersonal relationships, end quote. Adorno. Open Marxists understood economic categories as an inversion of social categories, and consequently they consider that things, quote, can be different only in different social relations, end quote. Bonafelt. If the economic abstractions, money and market forces, are left to be uncontrollable, quote, they act as incalculable natural forces, end quote. For critical theory, quote, economic relations are not glorified. It is intended rather that they should take on such a shape that their role in men's lives becomes unimportant, end quote. Schmidt. The content of the open Marxist critique of political economy and Kozik's statement, quote, poetry is not a reality of a lower order that is economics, end quote, is encapsulated nicely in Horkheimer's words. Quote, in my Platonic academy, the lowest grades will be taught the critique of political economy. I would have to draw all the consequences that follow from it. They will be brought up to be active dialecticians and introduced to practice. In the upper grades, they would have to understand me arme, I think that's how you say it, but without forgetting the other, end quote. Horkheimer. Far from being infallible, perfect, complete, and absolute, the character of this critical stance is always subject to the possibility of being wrong. According to Agnoli, the objective of being revolutionary cannot be separated from the practice of permanent critical analysis of one's own positions. In this sense, the headquarters are still to be bombed, but not those of the enemy. The, quote, headquarters of open Marxism, end quote, have to be critically attacked. Open critique and self-critique are part of the openness of open Marxism. Quote, Thought is negation. Resistance is whatever imposes itself. ... Thought runs counter to positivity. End quote. Axelos Kozik and certain members of the Praxis group in Yugoslavia regarded the openness of Marxism as meaning an open and creative dialogue with phenomenology and existentialism. Also, Polish open Marxists endeavored to open their own version of Marxism to empirical research methods and incorporate the sociological methods and conceptual tools of positivism and traditional theory into their analysis. Either that was a genuine expression of a philosophical interest to enrich the Marxist theoretical discussion, or it was intended as an act of resistance against vulgar and closed institutional Marxism, or it was part of the succession of intellectual fads and meant a fashionable philosophical exercise that sought to follow the theoretical fashions of the zeitgeist in Europe during the 1960s, or it was a combination of all three of these. It is hard to be precise. Furthermore, concepts such as, quote, alienation had become part of the official theoretical and political jargon of countries like Yugoslavia and Poland. This openness of Marxism and interest in other theoretical currents, philosophical traditions, and research methods affected different scholars in a variety of ways, marked their intellectual and political itinerary, and their final departure from Marxism in the direction of espousing liberal, conservative, or even nationalist positions. Kozik's open Marxism was fiercely criticized by Zvitak in Czechoslovakia. I think I had something about Zvitak on this channel. I think he was in the Socialist Humanist Compendium put together by Erich Fromm, which I have a lot of those pieces on this channel. Zvitak understood the transformation of the Marxian theory into institutional Marxism and Stalinism neither as a degradation nor a betrayal of the original ideas. The metamorphosis of Marxism was a, quote, parallel to the fundamental transformation of the social structure and an epiphenomenon of the formation of the new class, end quote. Zvitak. According to Zvitak, in a class-based and exploitative society, open Marxism was an attempt by the ideologists of the reformist movement to demonstrate that Marxism, that is, Stalinism, was in fact an open system capable of absorbing Western philosophy, science, and psychoanalysis. It was an attempt to open institutional Marxism to the West and other theoretical viewpoints. Open Marxism was the theoretical core of an effort to change Stalinism in Eastern Europe into a form of socialist humanism, a socialism with a human face. As such, the, quote, theoretical chimera of open Marxism, end quote, was an ideological illusion and self-deception of East European intellectuals, a, quote, Sartrean chimera, end quote, a, quote, pure ideological illusion of the epoch, end quote, that, quote, combined the theory of Marx with everything possible, with sociology, psychoanalysis, existentialism, phenomenology, cybernetics, Jesus Christ, and Francois Sagan, end quote, Zvitak. This kind of eclecticism was a, quote, simple-minded attempt to transplant Sartre's existentialized Marxism in Eastern Europe, end quote, intended to demonstrate that Marxism is as open to modifications and changes as every other science. For Zvitak, open Marxism was, quote, somewhat de-Stalinized Stalinism, end quote, that, quote, created theoretical conflicts on the highest plane of abstraction, end quote, but failed to take into consideration the actual problems and social conflicts. However, in one of his earlier contributions, Zvitak broached the subject of theoretical humanism and argued that the, quote, work of Roger Garaudy, who went on to become a Holocaust denier after becoming a Muslim, Adam Schaff, who was top of the Polish Communist Party, I can't remember what the specific term is, and Karl Kozik, in evaluating contemporary philosophical anthropology and existentialism, an important step forward in the whole approach to the problem, but these authors themselves do not consider their conclusions definite, end quote. Zvitak. It seems that Zvitak's kind of critique manages to grasp some of the limitations of open Marxism's openness to existentialism and phenomenology, but overall it does not do justice to the whole undertaking, especially when it is expressed, as he wrote, as a critical evaluation and judgment of phenomenology and existentialism that was formulated from the standpoint of Marx's critical categories. It is revealing that Kozik himself sent a letter to Marcuse asking Marcuse about his views on the relationship between Heidegger and Marx and Heidegger and Lukács. Marcuse's response of 1963 was adamant and to a certain extent a remark that could also be applied to Axelos' effort to read Marx along with Heidegger. Quote, today I would reject any attempt to assert an intrinsic or extrinsic affinity between Heidegger and Marx. Heidegger's affirmative stance with regard to Nazism is, in my opinion, nothing but an expression of the deeply anti-humane, anti-intellectual, historically reactionary, and life-repudiating tendencies of Heidegger's philosophy. End quote. Marcuse. Marcuse also commented on the relationship between Heidegger and Lukács. Quote, I remember having heard from Heidegger himself that he had never read Lukács. I have no reason to doubt that. End quote. Marcuse. Quote, Marxist attempts to use bourgeois sociology as the basis of the critique of dogmatism, end quote, are bound to fail, end quote, are easily assimilated by the latter, end quote. Clark's point could succinctly summarize the CSE open Marxist critique of other currents of open Marxism. It could equally well be applied to the critique of both neo-Gramscian and Althusserian Marxism. Quote, once the bourgeois alternative to, quote, reductionism versus, quote, pluralism is accepted, the rejection of dogmatism can only lead to the pluralism of bourgeois sociology, end quote. Clark. As the personal, political, and theoretical trajectory of certain individuals in the open Marxist stream in Eastern Europe indicated, the ease with which Marxism was mixed and combined with other philosophical orientations made them vulnerable to absorption into the frame of reference of positivism, liberalism, and bourgeois ideology. Kolakowski turned to liberal conservative positions and espoused capitalism and liberal ideology. Certain members of the Praxis group in Yugoslavia also became liberals, and others like Markovic ended up endorsing nationalist policies in the 1990s. I think Markovic ended up supporting Serbian nationalism, supporting Milosevic. So I always put things up from him. When I have put things up from him, I always put them up with a bit of caution because I know what his trajectory was. But we should always remember that someone's trajectory does not indicate that it was always there, right? It was always just waiting to bubble to the surface it poisons the entirety of their early writings. That's not the way to approach the history of ideas. As Kozik pointed out, quote, dialectics can justify morality if it is itself moral. The morality of dialectics is contained in its consistency, which in a destructive, all-encompassing process does not falter in the face of anything or anyone, end quote. The morality of negative critique is contained in its consistent policy of not only being a radical critique of Stalinism and social democracy, but also a subversive critique of capitalism, fascism, and nationalism. Open Marxism's critique of Leninism, Stalinism, and social democracy presupposes anti-capitalism, anti-fascism, and anti-nationalism. Otherwise, its ideas would be ridiculed and be easily integrated into the liberal agenda, thus justifying dogmatism and exonerating Leninism, Stalinism. The open Marxist tradition has not been immune from the zeitgeist and theoretical fashions. It is also in danger of becoming part of the market spirit that prevails in today's pseudo-theoretical landscape in academia. Quote, no theory today escapes the marketplace. Each one is offered as a possibility among competing opinions. All are put for choice. All are swallowed, end quote. Adorno. The historical development of the open Marxist currents is not free from the priests of hope and despair, from personal disputes and bitterness, from ruthless self-promotion and self-advertisement in the market of ideas, from subjection to the rules of the game and to what is demanded by the laws of the market or the mechanisms of power. Of course, this is human, all too human. On the other hand, as Stutzler noted, there were those who were, quote, most successful in getting a hearing in social movement context, end quote. Context, end quote. Marcel Stutzler. No doubt, however, with open Marxism and what is today called critical theory in general, quote, as with wine, the capacity to travel does not necessarily reflect the quality of the passenger, end quote. Goodwin. 1973. In his wonderful book entitled Anarchy's Brief Summary Regarding the Social Revolution in Spain from 1936 to 1939, Enzensberger wrote about the old anarchists that he met in their exile 35 years after the defeat of the Spanish Revolution. Quote, the world of old comrades is not immune to frustrations and jealousies, disputes and estrangements, the stigmata of the exiles. But this defeated and aging revolution has not lost its integrity. Spanish anarchism, for which all these men and women fought their whole lives, is never a sect on the margins of society, an intellectual fashion, or a bourgeois, quote, playing with fire, end quote. It was a proletarian mass movement and has less in common with the neo-anarchism of today's student groups than all those groups' manifestos and slogans might lead you to believe. For these old workers, culture is a good thing. This is not at all surprising, since they conquered their literacy with blood and sweat. In their small dark houses, there are no televisions, only books, end quote. Enzensberger, 2017. It makes little sense to hypostatize or romanticize past generations, political and historical events, or theoretical developments. However, one cannot help but think of the chaotic difference between the revolutionary tradition of the oppressed and today's, quote, intellectual fashions, end quote, and the fashionable bourgeois descendants who, quote, play with Marxist theory and eccentric ideas, and quote, presenting themselves as open Marxists, value form theorists, neo-Gramscian and Althusserian Marxists, political Marxists, and so on, quote, in having a superficially advanced and sophisticated character, end quote, in quote, offering a central place in the revolutionary process to the intellectual, end quote, as Clark characteristically noted, the basis of Althusserianism's appeal to these young intellectuals, the self-proclaimed, quote, new hegemons, end quote, deprived of but in search of quote hegemony, end quote, is not to their political but to their bourgeois intellectual instincts, end quote. As Bonafelt aptly pointed out, quote, hegemony is not a critical concept. Hegemony's grasp of society is traditional, end quote. Bonafelt. Vanity, conformism, hobby, and lifestyle Marxism turn liberal radicalism into abstract prestige and reduce thought to a commodity. The following questions inevitably arise. Whose interests do they serve? What is the intention behind all this activity? How are all these Marxisms connected to social content and the real social and political situation? What good is all these empty polemics, fascination with the void and catchy concepts, and cult of insignificance and emptiness which is embellished with a Marxist jargon? The, quote, pachyderms proliferate, end quote, and increasingly we experience a witness within the various Marxist trends and the traditional left that, quote, there's mechanical behavior, an absence of life, and therefore of thought, and there's mechanical language, end quote. Ionesco to Bonnefoy, 1970. As Ionesco noted, writing about the Marxists of his times in France, quote, though they call themselves Marxists, they are in fact petty bourgeois with political ambitions, a desire for power, end quote. Ionesco and Bonnefoy, 1970. The, quote, conformism of the nonconformists, end quote, is expressed as a desire for distinction, publishing for the sake of publishing, franchise, quote, Marxist conferences, ruthless self-glorification and self-praise, egocentrism and self-centeredness, vainness, emptiness, and superficiality. As Adorno eloquently put it, quote, the collective stupidity of research technicians is not simply an absence or regression of intellectual faculties, but a proliferation of the thinking faculty itself, which consumes thought with its own strength. The masochistic malice of young intellectuals springs from the malignance of their disease, end quote. Adorno. In the hands of these, quote, young intellectuals, end quote, open Marxism in danger of losing all critical bite, of losing its dangerous and lapsing into empty verbiage and ossified cliches, cleverness for its own sake, and verbalism without any content, let alone radical content, where thought processes are automatized and marketable, quote, value theorists emerge and prevail. As Stoyanovich pointed out, quote, if one understands theory in the Marxist sense, one must live it. Being a Marxist is not purely a purely theoretical matter. Marxism is a moral political orientation as well. The principle of the unity of theory and practice, upon which Marxists have insisted so strongly, must be embodied in their lives. Only those theorists whose conceptions are at the same time their convictions will fight for a revolutionary humanist program, since convictions represent one's intrinsic dispositions for commitment and action, both when it is politically safe as well as when it is not. The Marxist must maintain his integrity, end quote. Stoyanovich. Rosa Luxemburg acknowledged this problem of mechanical thought and language very clearly, and in her letter to Robert Zeidel in 2000. On the 23rd of June, 1898, Luxemburg made some very perceptive comments that could equally well be applied to some contemporary professional and fashionable, quote, value theorists and open or abstrusarian Marxists, and explain their conformism and mechanical thought and language. Yo, drop some proper names, man. Don't just say value theorists. What the hell is that? As if, also as well. Sorry, it's just kind of annoying me. It's not that I don't think there's validity in what is being said here, but like all the people that were involved in urban Marxism were academics. They might have had political opinions, and but they were just as much part of these fashionable Marxist conference circuits as anybody. Like I said when talking about Rebel earlier, Rebel was a Marx scholar. He was going back to the sources and trying to create meaning out of them. He might have been a council communist as well, but he was mainly an academic. He was mainly an intellectual historian in terms of what he actually did. As much as respect as I have for people like, Bonafelt and Holloway and all these people, is that they're all associate institutions and they're all going to have comfortable middle class retirements, which is fine. But that doesn't I'm not particularly like this kind of I don't know, just middle class careerists who just follow fads and want to make money. It's what you're all doing. It might not be all that they're all doing, right? But no one should get on their high horse. And I don't know who these value theorists he's referencing. Who's he referencing? Heinrich? Or who? I don't know. It's kind of I don't know. It kind of seems like a bitch if you're gonna call out whole concepts without really elaborating what's wrong with them, or something like that. Or label them fashionable. That's ridiculous. Also, what I think is ridiculous, as a side note, is open Marxism is very sexy, and I think one of the earmarks of a fad or a trend is the sexiness of it. It often builds on especially people like Holloway and Bonafelt and all those people who I love. They definitely build upon the poetics and rhetoric, and that's something you find in other critical theorists as well. And again, I mean, there's nothing wrong with that, and there's nothing wrong with the sexiness of a body of ideas, but it is subversiveness often has subversiveness often has a commodifying content. It something having the veneer, which I don't think is just veneer in the case of Marxism, to be clear, but has the appearance of bite. Very much lends itself to fads, right? And I think of all these things that kind of think all this very antisocial shit, certain interpretations of I don't know, theories that really lend themselves to identitarianism, and especially when that identitarianism kind of translates into a misanthropic form, or when people say things like Althusser, which I think it has actual, not Althusser, Pistone and Holloway and all the people open Marxism, when people talk about abolishing work, when they use the word abolishing and stuff like that, or communism being the abolition of the economy of labor or something like that. They use these very kind of rhetorical and poetic terms. It definitely that lends itself that very much lends itself to being a fad. Which it being a fad is not like or it being having some kind of traction based on maybe like on its rhetorical qualities isn't like necessarily a mark against it. I think also, for example, like, I don't know, you hear, like, I mean, maybe I'm not around the right people, but, like, you hardly ever hear people talk about, for instance, like, the Invisible Committee anymore, or Tikkun. I don't really hear about them. But when I was, in, like, the Occupy movement, when I was first getting into radical politics, all you heard about was Tikkun and the Invisible Committee. And the semiotext books of Tikkun and the Invisible Committee, they sold like hotcakes. And they were very, very subversive in their politics. And you can think of all kinds of shit now, especially with like even though it's not something that everyone agrees, like I certainly don't agree with, but like settler colonial studies and like decolonization and stuff, where they just kind of like just make all these kind of like grand declarations about the inhumanity of like entire groups of people, the inherent inhumanity of like entire groups of people. Like, that's sexy. Like, and people like the bite of it is an appeal in and of itself. So let's not get in, I think he was saying a very good thing earlier in this chapter about like not turning open Marxism into like some kind of like absolute or like correct system or some kind of finalized system or some kind of finalized project. I think that's fantastic. We should also kind of like I think also related to that is we should not kind of like categorize anyone who doesn't adopt the open Marxist approach as like just like a careerist or like a fluffy historian or something like that. And the other thing that I think is important, that I think is like, this is just more me talking, so they're giving me opinions. I was kind of maybe getting needlessly annoyed by this, this section of the chapter. But the other thing is that like theory, like Marxism, like it's the thing with like when people say things about like Marxism, Marx not being an economist, or Marx not like, which is like true, he is putting like criticizing the foundations of economic sciences, but he is also putting forward an interpretation of how capitalism works, how capitalism functions, what are its conditions of existence, and not just in terms of like how they like are experienced by like people, but kind of like in a very like impersonal, cold way. Like, for instance, like, when you talk like if you're talking about commodity values versus prices of production, in terms of like, it's very important for understanding how capitalism works. So there is like a definitely like, it is extremely critical, but it's also explanatory as well. And also, I think that it's just my opinion, and you have to deal with them because I'm the one reading this, is that I also think that like Marxism and critical theory also are foundations for building, for doing empirical research, right? And I think that a lot of people, like, I think other people have tried to do that, right? They've tried to like these political Marxists, right? They're trying to give an account of how one of their main things is, how did capitalism, what is the historical constitution of capitalism? How did it come to be? What were the social conditions that allowed for the law of value to become prominent, be the dictating principle of production? how did it create an unprecedented, or a whole like how did it create the mass existence of the free wage labor? It's using Marxism to give a scientific and convincing account of a historical process, right? It's not just like a political thing. It's not just like talking about like, what does Marxism mean for a revolution? That's an important question. That's why I'm reading this book, because I think it's a very important question, and that's why you read other books like this. That's why I'll read Bonafelt and I read Holloway and those kinds of people, especially because I agree with much of their politics and their interpretation of Marxism as well, and what it's as well. But there's also like Marxism also is not just like it's not just a hammer. It's not just the thing that like shatters bourgeois ideology, or just kind of like critically unpacks the social constitution of concepts or something like that. It does that, of course, but it also is a way of conceptualizing social formations, including capitalism, and have a change over time. And it's a piece of it can be used for research, empirical research beyond just like forming a politics, right? And the Frankfurt School, they did this, right? They engaged. The history wasn't their big thing, but like empirical sociological studies, empirical social psychological studies, things of that sort. Fucking Neumann's Behemoth, or Friedrich Pollock on the possibilities of state capitalism, or other people. For instance, that's probably not a good example because he kind of left, but like I think Wittfogel was associated with the Frankfurt School at some point. So there is things to do with Marxism that are not as sexy as talking about how we change the world without taking power or something like that. And a lot of these people have done this. I think it was mentioned in a previous chapter, Bonafelt's study in the 80s about the nature of the state in the Thatcher period, right? It's more of like a history of ideas, but Bonafelt's also done work on the history of like ordo-liberalism, and it's like application to in its tenets, and it's also its application, how it was used in like the Treaty of Rome or whatever, in the post-war European settlement. So Marxism is a revolutionary, it is a form of revolutionary politics. It's a way of attaining enlightenment and attaining emancipation, but it's also a way of explaining his social processes, right? And I think that and I think it's I think that remains a relevant project, right? And I think Marxology remains a valuable project. I think so much of what is being talked about here is kind of fundamentally steeped in Marxology. For instance, so much of open Marxism, especially that of the journal Open Marxism proper, of Holloway, Bonafelt, and stuff, so much of it is based on very, very abstract considerations about what the nature of the capitalist state is in relation to the capitalist economy, and also what is value, what is exchange. Very kind of theoretical, kind of dull, not particularly sexy. If you read John Holloway, for instance, it is an enticing read. If you read Bonafelt for it as well, it's like an enticing read. Like it's like, oh, sick. This is fucking. Like you had the feeling of like you listened to a song that was sick. You know, like, oh, this is badass. But fucking there's resonance or whatever, as opposed to just knowledge. It's like I think that. Yeah, I mean, and also like that's Simon Clark's work, right? Simon Clark's fucking what's his book like about like marginalism and modern sociology and stuff like that. It's like a history of like the relationship between changes within capitalism and how it was how it was comprehended ideologically. And it didn't have like any immediate like glaring like political content. It's like a rich piece of like historical sociology and a rich piece of like the history of ideas. So, and not that like Memos would disagree with any of kind of like the things I'm saying here, but it's almost like, yeah, if you use like Marxism is just like a means to explain explain the world in order merely to like smash it. It's like that is true, but it's also a system, or maybe not system's not the best word, but is like a framework. That might be a better word. A framework, an unfinished framework from which to do empirical research that you would find people doing in like a university context, by people who have depending on what position they have, I think you could clearly say have broken into like what you conventionally conceive as like the middle class. Yeah, it's not just I don't know. And the other thing too is like I think the critique of capitalism that was laid out in Marx, I think it talks about, it's not, when he was talking earlier about Gunn saying like communism is like the movement of the actual, Marx says things like this too, but like it's the movement within society of like the proletariat seeking like freedom and dignity or whatever, something like that, or like just like it's just like almost like an already present thing. It's like, no, like in order for a non-commodity producing society that is worldwide, that is fundamentally international, there is certain like necessary mediations that must take place in order for that entire project to be viable. To just talk about communism in just like this super vague way of like the society of the free and equal, or like free association even, those kinds of things, like there is actual like necessary things that a communist society would have to accomplish, and it's not kind of like illegitimate to think about what those like necessary preconditions are, in kind of like on like an abstract theoretical level, even if they're like not immediately applicable to any kind of like on the ground movement that's happening. Sorry, I've gone on too long here. Sorry about that. Let me get back to what I'm saying here. Rosa Luxemburg acknowledged this problem of mechanical thought and language very early in her letter to Robert Zaido. On the 23rd of June, 1898, Luxemburg made some very perceptive comments that could equally be applied to some contemporary professional and fashionable, quote, value theorists and open or Althusserian Marxists, and explained their conformism of mechanical thought and language. She wrote, quote, "Do you know what gives me no peace nowadays? I'm dissatisfied with the form and manner in which people in the party, for the most part, write their articles. It's all so conventional, so wooden, so stereotyped," end quote. Luxemburg. And Luxemburg added in an attempt to explicate this phenomenon, quote, I believe that the source of this lies in the fact that people, when they're writing, forget for the most part to go deeper inside themselves and experience the full import and truth of what they're writing. I believe that people need to live in the subject matter fully and really experience it every time, every day, with every article they write. And then words will be found that are fresh, that come from the heart and go to the heart, instead of bracket just repeating in bracket the old familiar phrases, end quote. Luxembourg. And I mean, I haven't read it myself, but I'm sure that Luxembourg's accumulation of capital isn't a totally heart-wrenching read. I think there's this tension, I guess, between open Marxism and I guess the related Marxism. Pastone's been kind of mentioned a few times in this book. Like Pastone, in one of his interviews, it says a theory of society shouldn't motivate you. If you wanted to just be motivated to just go fight or just go be politically active or something like that, you could go to basically a radical self-help, or not radical self-help, but go see a motivational speaker. A theory should explain something about the world, right? It should be not just instrumentalized until for purposes of igniting fires in bellies or something like that, but actually try to give an account of historical dynamics and how they affect and their effect upon the world. Just writing things, and that's so much of this stuff is fire in your belly kind of shit, dude. It's so much pep talk. And it shouldn't be. And I'm more inclined to agree with Pastone that theory should explain something and not just get you going or something like that. And I think that is the earmark of a trend, right? Especially, and I think that also relates to trends, because once a piece of, once Marxism or whatever seeks to get your, the fire in your belly going, you'll move on to something else. If that's not doing it for you, you'll move on to some other kind of framework for interpreting the world, or some other kind of theory or intellectual hobby that'll stoke you up. I think that I think what's most exciting in academia and things of that sort is not this, and or the stuff that has the most. Sorry, I'm just repeating myself. But the stuff that has the most propensity to be trends is stuff that it's yeah, I liked how that made me feel. I want to read more stuff like that because it made me feel naughty or something like that. Anyway. When they write, critical theorists need to, quote, go deeper inside themselves, experience the full important truth of what they're writing, end quote. They, quote, need to live in the subject matter fully and really experience it every time, every day, with every article they write, end quote. And words need to, quote, come from the heart and go to the heart, end quote. Luxembourg. As Horkheimer succinctly put it in condensing the political and historical experience of the last 2 centuries, quote, the revolutionary career is not a series of banquets and a string of honorific titles, nor does it hold the promise of interesting research for professor salaries. It is a passage towards the unknown with misery, disgrace, ungratefulness, and prison as its way stations, end quote. As if Horkheimer himself didn't prioritize. If you read the book, just as another side note, if you read the famous book, I think it's Philip Lenhard, I think the name is, but it's a book about Pollock, but it's mainly about Pollock's relationship with Horkheimer and the Institute. It's not as much a intellectual biography as a biography proper. And one of the main things that's he seems to be saying is that one of the main things motivating Horkheimer is to live like a very comfortable, quiet, almost quiet, bourgeois middle class existence. No. Anyway, moving on. However, to paraphrase Comrade Lenin, there can be no, quote, revolutionary career, unquote, and revolutionary praxis without revolutionary theory. Choosing the path of revolutionary theory and praxis has consequences. Quote, revolutionary theory, unquote, De Boer wrote, quote, is now the sworn enemy of revolutionary ideology and revolutionary theory, De Boer wrote, quote, is now the sworn enemy of revolutionary ideology, and it knows it, end quote. De Boer. In their more subversive moments, the open Marxist scholars were aware of that. Unfortunately, the, quote, revolutionary ideology side also knew very well who their enemies were. When Axelos wrote that the so-called socialist bloc, seems to insult those who want to be open Marxists, end quote, it was something of an understatement about the persecution that open Marxists experienced in Eastern Europe. In 1968, due to the, quote, anti-Semitic and anti-revisionist campaign in Poland, representatives of the, quote, open Marxism, end quote, were removed from academia and forced to leave the country, end quote. Zurich, 2007. During these persecutions, quote, Bauman was portrayed as one of the symbols of, quote, revisionism and expelled from the university, along with Leszek Kolakowski, Władimir Brus, and Maria Herchowicz, end quote. And soon afterwards, quote, Zygmunt Bauman and Maria Herchowicz would be forced to leave Poland, end quote. Godula. Certain members of the Praxis group were expelled from the party for having, quote, advocated very extreme anarcho-liberal positions, unquote. You hear that term all the time now, anarcho-liberal. 8 members were dismissed from their posts in universities. And on the 21st of February 1975, it was announced that the journal Praxis, quote, had been closed after its editorial board had rejected an ultimatum from the authorities, end quote. Scher, 1977. In Czechoslovakia in the 1970s and 1980s, Kozik was, quote, banned from all academic work. And if Kozik's work was mentioned at all, it was only as an example of a, quote, dangerous revisionist deviation, end quote. End quote. Feinberg, Landa, and Mervart, 2022. Kozik was, quote, expelled from the CC, then from the Communist Party, then from his position as professor at the university and researcher at the Philosophical Institute, end quote. Louvy. Footnote. According to Louvy, I'm assuming it's referring to Michael Louvy. According to Louvy, quote, from that moment on, a period of 20 difficult years began for Kozik as a persecuted philosopher and a citizen without rights. In 1972, Kozik was apprehended and submitted to a long and humiliating interrogation. In April 1975, the police invaded Kozik's home, searched the premises for 6 hours, and confiscated some thousands of pages of manuscripts of 2 books in preparation, one titled On Practice and another titled On Truth, which were considered, quote, proof of the criminal activity of subversion against the Republic, end quote, unquote. Louvy. Quote, however, after 20 years of opposing the bureaucratic regime, Kozik would soon become an oppositionist to the new right-wing governments which came to power in Prague. The critical thinker who refused the dictatorship of the party equally rejected market absolutism, end quote. I think that's actually kind of a similar thing. I don't know if you'd call him an open Marxist. He's definitely some kind of humanist. István Mészáros in Hungary, right? He was kind of like had to leave Hungary basically after 1956, but remained an anti-capitalist, even though he was living in the West. Quote, as Kozik explains in an interview given to an Italian friend, quote, they told me that I should at last be reasonable, march with the, quote, spirit of the times, end quote, and put myself like many others, at the service of the newly ascendant ideology, end quote. Kozik. Since Kozik refused to comply, the new powers that be of new lib of sorry, since he refused to comply, the new powers that be of neoliberal orientation would expel him from his position at the university in 1992, exactly as the authorities imposed by the Soviet tanks had done in 1969, end quote. Levy. And footnote. After the police's search of Kozik's flat and the confiscation of his manuscripts in April 1975, Kozik sent a letter to Jean-Paul Sartre in which, among other things, he noted, quote, "I am dead and at the same time I am alive," end quote. Kozik and Sartre, 1975. Kozik's words capture the historical and theoretical journey of the open Marxist critical theory to a certain extent. Subversive critical theory has survived through its political defeats, persecutions, and marginalization. Open Marxism survived because of and despite oppression, sidelining, and discrediting. It survived because of its struggle for intellectual autonomy from the party and the state apparatus, and because of thinking against the current, being constantly oppositional, permanently dissident, heretic, and unorthodox, on the side of the losers and defeated in world history. The open Marxist critical ideas disappeared underground at times, existing as a subterranean current, banned from academia and deprived of the institutional Marxist quote, scientific respectability, end quote. Open Marxism is pronounced dead several times, but it is still alive. In the everyday struggles for social emancipation all over the world, open Marxism's negative critique of both capitalism and institutional Marxism recurs as an already existing possibility, as a living, creative, and subversive critical theory. It encapsulates the spirit of resistance of critical thought in the, quote, now time, end quote, which, quote, comprises the entire history of mankind in a tremendous abbreviation, end quote, Benjamin. And it reemerges as a living past, quote, which continues to affect us under a different sign, in the drive of its questions, in the experiments of its answers, ... the dead return transformed, end quote, Bloch. Continuing and renewing the tradition of critical Marxism and militant Enlightenment, open Marxism, quote, carries with it a secret index, end quote, and is part of a, quote, secret agreement between past generations and the present one, end quote, that makes us painfully aware that, quote, even the dead will not be safe from the enemy if he is victorious, end quote, Benjamin. To paraphrase Adorno, to lend a voice to the, quote, dead means that we, quote, constantly call into question every victory, past and present, of the rulers, end quote, Benjamin. And this is the condition of all truth and all critical and subversive thought. Again, Enzensberger lends a voice to the, quote, dead Spanish anarchist, but it could be the voice of the, quote, dead Yugoslav, Greek, French, German, Italian, Soviet, or Latin American communists and partisans. Quote, when one gets to know them, one is shocked to discover how little disorientation and bitterness there is among them, much less than in their young guests. They are not sad. Their amiability is proletarian. They have the dignity of people who have never surrendered. They are not indebted to anyone for anything. No one, quote, sponsored them. They accepted nothing, nor have they been awarded any grants or subsidies. They are not interested in welfare. They are incorruptible. Their conscience is intact. They are not failures. Their physical condition is excellent. They are neither beaten men nor neurotics. They do not need drugs. They do not feel sorry for themselves. They regret nothing. Their defeats have not discouraged them. They know that they made mistakes, but they never gave up. The old men of the revolution are stronger than the world that succeeded them. End quote. Enzensberger. Just a side note, these anarchists might not be resentful of themselves towards each other as anarchists, but they most certainly would be resentful against the Stalinist and the Republic, which betrayed the anarchists. If they're not resentful, like, I don't know. I mean, they might not be resentful to each other. They might be amiable to strangers, but I suppose I don't think they would be particularly amiable or unbitter towards a Stalinist. And I think in all of these cases, you know, I'm sorry, I'm getting lost in the details here, but in all of these cases, the French was highly divided, especially if you talk about places like Greece or the Soviet Union, where like the left opposition was just like straight up murdered. Anyway, arguably the old men of the revolution were stronger than those in the world that succeeded them. Over the last 40 years, life has become more and more chaotic and meaningless, and the resistance to reification has itself been reified. The distinction between true and false, essential and superfluous, beautiful and ugly, moral and immoral has been blurred. It seems that those who were once politically active and left politics have forgotten who they are and where they have come from. The features that characterize the struggle and life of the working class people and the human qualities necessary to establish a truly different social organization and a new global human condition appear to have been eclipsed. Quote, rhinoceros, and quote, apathy, superficiality, depoliticization, immaturity, and immorality have spread over a large part, probably the majority of the population, and collective stupidity, cynicism, infantilism, narcissism, and the poverty of everyday life have permeated all areas. Quote, there are more dead people than living, and their numbers are increasing. The living are getting rarer, end quote. Ionesco. Against this background, the critical reconstruction of the most subversive and insurgent elements of the subterranean tradition and the theoretical legacy of open Marxism can serve as an act of resistance to social regression. It can contribute enormously to a resignification of the form and content of social struggles and revolutionary ideas, and lead to theoretical and practical openings, thus strengthening the emancipatory moment and serving as a foundational source of social critique and revolutionary praxis. It could enable us to reclaim one of the most critical, negative, liberating functions of socialist thought, along with the values and practices of the, quote, old men and women of the revolution, end quote. To hold a mirror up to our lives and our struggles. Open Marxism constitutes part of the accumulated theoretical and practical experience of our struggles for human emancipation. As such, open Marxism's negative and subversive critique challenges the most radical currents of the anti-capitalist tradition, and, at the same time, it is challenged by them as they coexist and work together to form a, quote, radically critical and political synthesis of experience, end quote, which could reemerge, quote, in the light of the real possibility of a, quote, better world to live in, end quote, in the light of the possible reduction of pain, cruelty, injustice, and stupidity, end quote. Marcuse. The critical theory of open Marxism could decisively contribute as a, quote, constitutive act, end quote, to open up like a political and theoretical space in order to create the, quote, revolutionary imperative, end quote. This, quote, revolutionary imperative is, quote, indeed not only a political but also, indeed, and perhaps even primarily, an intellectual and moral imperative. It is in and through the unfolding of subversive thinking and social struggles that such a, quote, revolutionary imperative, end quote, unifies intelligence, morality, the spirit of resistance and sacrifice, political education and maturity, and has as its objective to break the continuum of history by the deployment of, quote, confidence, courage, humor, cunning, and fortitude, end quote. As Horkheimer reminded us, quote, the spreading of darkness has always been a technique of the right, end quote. The subversive critique of open Marxism sought to shed light, reveal, and express the contradictions of the dark times. Quote, there's a crack in everything, that's how the light gets in, end quote. Bonafelt, 23a, footnote. See also Leonard Cohen's Anthem. The ideologies of the past century, quote, occluded reality, kept people in the dark, like a dark cave, so they see nothing, end quote. However, critical theory as militant enlightenment, quote, illuminates every cave, end quote. Kozik. The lesson and essence of the history of open Marxism and the struggles of the old men and women of the revolution is to preserve the, quote, obstinacy that comes from adhering to truth against all appearances, end quote. Marcuse, and to, quote, persevere no matter what, end quote. Kozik. Never give up, never surrender. Quote, revolutionary transformation is a tradition that must continue, end quote. Horkheimer. An uplifting final passage. That's the end of this chapter, which again is chapter 6 of Open Marxism, Critical Theory as Militant Enlightenment by Christos Memos. Open Marxism as a critic, and the chapter is titled Open Marxism as Critical Social Theory and the Struggle for a New Global Human Condition. I really like that. A new global human condition. That's a good phrase. I'm going to steal that. That's the last chapter of this book. I've really gotten a lot out of reading this book, despite that passage, with that little passage there about me, bitching about what is and what is not an academic fad or trend, or how much Marxism constitutes a social science might suggest. I thought this was a really fascinating book. I also have Christos Memos' book on Castriatus on the channel, which is also phenomenal. But I've really enjoyed this work. So thank you for listening.